In the early 1800s, young, light-skinned female slaves were sold by slave traders. They were sold for profit to wealthy slave owners in the American South for the explicit purpose of sexual exploitation. These young women were sold into the dangerous life of prostitution and concubinage. Many died at a young age due to violence and disease. These women were enslaved for life and the property of their owners. Robert Lumpkin ran the largest slave breeding farm in the nation. The breeding farm was located in Richmond, Virginia. Lumpkin had 5 children with a slave named Mary. Mary was born in 1832, the possible biracial child of a black enslaved woman and her white owner. She was sold as a young girl and purchased by Robert Lumpkin, a man who was 27 years older than her and known for being violent. Mary was forced to bear his children, having the first of their 5 children when she was only 13 years old. Slave traders referred to these young, light-skinned female slaves as fancy girls. Fancy girls were typically teenagers, but were sometimes girls under the age of 10. Like most slaves, fancy girls were generally illiterate and defenseless in opposing the will of their owners. Under the slave codes, they were the property of their owners and had no rights or say in how they were treated. Chattel slavery gave slave owners the right to treat slaves any way they pleased. It was the form of slavery that existed in the American South. Enslaved people could be bought, sold, and owned forever from the 16th through 18th centuries. An enslaver could extract labor from an enslaved person against their will. An enslaver could sexually exploit an enslaved person without consent and by violent means. In 1705, the Virginia slave codes allowed slave owners to punish their slaves, even if it resulted in the death of a slave, without any repercussions. In George v. State, the Supreme Court of Mississippi ruled in 1859 that a black enslaved man could not be convicted of raping an enslaved woman because it was only a crime to commit a rape upon a white woman. The buying and selling of light-skinned female slaves, for the explicit purpose of sexual exploitation, was called the fancy girl trade. Generally, slave traders purchased light-skinned female slaves from plantation owners in states like Virginia and Maryland. Declining tobacco production caused many tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake Bay region to become cash-strapped. These plantations had a surplus of slaves. Selling slaves to cotton plantations in the Deep South became a reliable source of income. Virginia and Maryland were the leading exporter of slaves in the nation. The export of slaves exceeded the export of tobacco. The domestic slave trade tore young women from their families, who they might never see again. Slave traders then sold these female slaves to wealthy slave owners in the Deep South for the explicit purpose of sexual exploitation. The fancy girl trade was lucrative. Virginia, the oldest slave-holding state, had the largest number of mixed-race enslaved people of all the southern states, totaling approximately 40,000 in 1850. Interracial sexual relationships began in the early 1600s when enslaved Africans first arrived in the English colony of Jamestown, Virginia. Slave traders transported fancy girls from the Chesapeake Bay region to New Orleans, approximately 1,000 miles, by foot, in coffles, or in tightly packed slave ships. New Orleans was one of the wealthiest cities in the nation due to the slave trade and the global demand for cotton. Wealthy people who were interested in buying or selling slaves were drawn to New Orleans, the nation's largest slave market. Fancy girls were a status symbol for wealthy men, such as planters, traders, gamblers, and saloon keepers. An attractive fancy girl was valued at more than $1,500, or $30,000 in today's dollars. In New Orleans, fancy girls were on display for prospective buyers throughout the city. They were on the auction blocks in the sumptuous rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel, private residences, public parks, decks of ships moored along the Mississippi, high-walled slave pens, and commercial complexes such as Banks Arcade all served as sites for the buying and selling of enslaved people. The modern term for the fancy girl trade is sex trafficking, which is illegal today. Nonetheless, sex trafficking continues to exist in the United States and around the world. Sex trafficking is human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Victims are forced into sexual acts non-consensually. Activities associated with sex trafficking include prostitution, pornography, child sex rings, sex tourism, and such occupations as nude dancing and modeling. The fancy girl trade was not illegal in the early 1800s. The South was a rape culture where the sexual abuse of enslaved women was normal and trivialized. In fact, federal law facilitated the practice. Laws such as the Fugitive Slave Act made it difficult for female slaves to run away from their owners. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required that slaves be returned to their owners even if they were in a free state. The act made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying runaway slaves. Fancy girls who appeared to be white had a better chance of traveling to a non-slave-holding state and blending into white society. A runaway slave could escape to a non-slave-holding state, only to be captured and returned to slavery many years later. At slave auctions, fancy girls were the most expensive category of female slave. Fancy girls sold at slave auctions for 4 to 5 times the price of a female field laborer. Fancy girls sometimes sold for as much or more than a prime male field laborer. The largest market for fancy girls was New Orleans, but fancy girls were bought and sold throughout the South in big cities, small towns, and rural areas. In his book Runaways, Coffles and Fancy Girls, Bill Carey writes, fancy girls, young, female slaves singled out as sex concubines, were sold in Nashville and even openly advertised in the newspapers. In New Orleans, fancy girls were purchased by plantation owners, saloon keepers, bordello owners, and riverboat operators. A fancy girl was likely to end up as a prostitute or concubine. For wealthy white men, owning a fancy girl was a status symbol. Many of these men were married, but kept fancy girls as mistresses. The owner of a fancy girl could sell her to a slave trader or another slave owner at any time. Slave codes throughout the South made it illegal for an enslaved person to marry a white person. Wealthy men could purchase fancy girls in order to satisfy their exotic sexual fantasies. Some fancy girls appeared to be white, but were still considered enslaved under the law. Enslaved women were the property of their owners, and their owners could sexually abuse them as they pleased. A slave owner could rape a fancy girl without being charged with the crime of rape. On the other hand, a man who raped a white woman could be criminally charged with rape. Furthermore, if a man got a fancy girl pregnant, he would not be financially responsible for the child. Under slave codes, the child was considered illegitimate. Nonetheless, the child was his property and he could sell the child to a slave trader or another slave owner. On plantations, it was a common practice for owners and overseers to rape their female slaves. Fancy girls were typically the product of sexual intercourse between a mixed-race couple. An enslaved woman was impregnated by a white man, who could be her owner, a relative or friend of her owner, or an overseer. An enslaved woman who rejected these advances was often violently raped, whipped, or punished in some other fashion. The birth of a child by an enslaved mother increased the owner's wealth by increasing the number of slaves he owned. In 1662, Virginia enacted the enactment of hereditary slavery law, which made any child who was born of a slave mother a slave for life. According to Harriet Jacobs, who wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, in 1867, everyone on a plantation knew which children were fathered by the master. Only the master's wife pretended not to know that her husband had fathered mixed-race children with his female slaves. The child could be put to work on the plantation or sold to another plantation for a profit. It did not matter if the child appeared to be white. As Jacobs points out, the children who were created from these affairs were often sold to another owner in order to protect the honor and dignity of the master's wife, or she would be forced to face the fact that her husband was having affairs with his slaves. In the early 1800s, the fancy girl trade was a lucrative segment of the domestic slave trade. In 1808, the United States banned the importation of slaves from Africa. The ban restricted the supply of slaves, thus making the domestic slave trade more profitable. With the invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s, the cultivation of cotton became profitable in a region of the Deep South known as the Cotton Kingdom. In the 1830s, the federal government removed Native Americans from their homelands in the South, thus expanding the area for cotton cultivation by millions of acres. Cotton became the fabric of choice for both American and European clothing manufacturers. By the 1830s, the United States was the leading exporter of cotton in the world. Cotton was a key component of the industrial age in both Britain and America. However, the cultivation of cotton was labor-intensive and required slave labor. To meet the growing demand for slave labor, approximately 1 million slaves were transported from the Upper South, such as the Chesapeake Bay region, to the Deep South, states such as Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The Great Migration of slaves southward was known as the Second Middle Passage. Fancy girls from places like the Chesapeake Bay region were part of this Great Migration to the Deep South. Slave traders like Franklin and Armfield purchased fancy girls from farms and plantations in the Chesapeake Bay region because they knew that these girls could be sold in New Orleans and Natchez for significantly higher prices. Franklin and Armfield was the largest and most successful domestic slave trading firm of the 1830s. The firm's three partners, Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard, were obsessed with the notion of raping black women, particularly light-skinned black women who were known as mulattoes. The partners referred to themselves as one-eyed men, a euphemism for their penises. They referred to young, attractive, light-skinned black women as fancy maids. Cornell University professor Edward E. Baptist, in his article, Cuffy, Fancy Maids, and One-Eye Men, Rape Commodification and the Domestic Slave Trade, writes this about Franklin and Armfield. The business was a slave trading partnership, and systematic rape and sexual abuse of slave women were part of the normal practice of the men who ran the firm. The partners knew that their customers in the Deep South were also obsessed with the notion of raping mulatto women. Since Franklin was stationed in New Orleans, Armfield in Alexandria, and Ballard in Richmond, they corresponded with each other through letters. These letters show that the partners viewed mulatto women not only as a means of obtaining enormous profits, but also as a means of satisfying their own sexual desires. Slave traders were known to sexually exploit the fancy girls in their custody prior to auctioning them at slave auctions. At slave auctions, slave traders presented fancy girls in a fashion that would appeal to wealthy slave owners. A skinny, fancy girl was fed corn, pone, and pork to fatten her up. Scars would be covered with wax to make them less visible. Fancy girls received instructions on how to present themselves and on what to say when responding to questions from prospective buyers. Fancy girls were well-dressed, coiffed, and sometimes wore jewelry. Prospective buyers could view fancy girls in the nude and touch their private areas prior to purchase. Being in the custody of slave traders was not a pleasant experience. Slave traders kept these women in prison like structures called slave jails that were crowded, filthy, and rampant with disease. Several months could pass between the time a fancy girl was purchased in the Chesapeake Bay region and later sold in New Orleans or Natchez. Measles, cholera, helminthiasis, whooping cough, pneumonia, and other diseases killed many slaves who were confined in slave jails and during grueling 1,000-mile marches, known as coffles. The deadliness of these diseases was compounded by close confinement, poor nutrition, filthy conditions, brutal treatment, and a lack of adequate medical care. Fancy girls were not always purchased by men. A female owner of a brothel could purchase a fancy girl to work as a prostitute. Unfortunately, due to violence and disease, women who entered the sex trade tended to die within a few years. In 1858, William W. Sanger, a prominent New York City physician, conducted a groundbreaking study of prostitution. The study was entitled The History of Prostitution. Sanger found that once women became entangled in sex work, they often died within 4 years. Sanger also found that at least 50% of prostitutes had sexually transmitted diseases.